Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday. Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Friday? Maybe some people are busy getting ready for Shabbos. Maybe some people are busy turning over the house, getting ready for Pesach. There's so much to do. Removing all of the chametz out of the house. Got to search every room, clean it up. And part of that final search for the chametz is to ask ourselves in each room, where did I act like chametz? Where was I all puffed up with my own self-importance and I was impatient and arrogant with others? What did I do? How did I do it? We got to examine our deeds as well as doing all the physical work of searching out the chametz. Who's in the house on a Friday? Yehud in South Carolina. Gordo in Scotland. Always great to see your name here on Fridays. Paul in the Great Northwest. Nancy. Wait a minute, it skipped on me. Nancy's still at work. We'll catch the replay. John in Maine. Renee. Shabbat Shalom. Joe in the Inland Empire. Paul is saying hi. Nina. Randy in Florida. Melissa in Great Neck. Michael in Arizona, Susan in Los Angeles, and Eliana Chaya. Eliana or Alana? Eliana Chaya in Minneapolis. Welcome. Great to see you here. Shandor in the Bronx. Guy in Ohio. Great to be together. All right, our daf is relatively short and relatively complicated. Let's get into it and keep our thinking hats on. I'll read it maybe a little bit slower than I usually do so we can keep it straight. Excuse me. Not a cold. Spring is coming. So it's my hay fever. All right, let's get to work. We are continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 4. Our page is 50, page 50, Daf Nun, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. Let's do it. A dilemma was raised before the sages. According to the opinion of the rabbis, that one has only until a period of time has passed that would allow him to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative in order to claim that he has been exploited. Right, so the basic concept here, this Mishnah number 2, is that a seller can only charge a buyer up to 1/6 above the market value of the item. Any more than that, this is deemed exploitative, and the buyer can come back and say, refund my purchase, you exploited me, I paid too much. Or, as we saw yesterday, he could just say, refund the difference. You charged me too much. He has that choice. And also, if the buyer paid, too little, right? So the seller maybe didn't know that what he was selling had a higher market value than he was selling it at. So then the seller could say the same thing. But the basic idea was that after the buyer has an advantage because he has the item. So he can go and show it to somebody who would understand the market value of that item better than he does. And then when he finds out that he was overcharged, he can come back to the seller and ask for that refund, either to undo the whole transaction or to get the difference between what he paid and what would have not been exploitative. But there's a time limit, right? So it's the amount of time that it would take to go show somebody who is knowledgeable, a merchant or his relative, the item and come back. And beyond that, it's assumed that he waived his right to get that refund. So, let's just read that again. So according to the opinion of the rabbis, that one has only until a period of time has passed that would allow him to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative in order to claim that he has been exploited. So in a case where the disparity between the value of the purchase item and the price paid is less than 1/6, is there a waiver of the discrepancy and therefore the transaction is finalized immediately? Or in this case as well, is the transaction finalized only after the time that it takes for the buyer to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative, right? Interesting question. So if we're saying that he has that amount of time to find out that he's been exploited and then come back and ask for a refund, well, what if he wasn't exploited? Do we say that there's a waiver of this period to go have it checked and therefore the deal is finalized immediately? Or do we always have this kind of cooling off period where one can find out whether he was exploited or not? And then what? Since it's not finalized until that period passes, maybe in a shorter amount of time than that, he could just undo the deal because we're within that period? And in addition, if you say that the transaction is finalized only after the time that it takes to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative, so what difference is there between a disparity of 1/6 and a disparity of less than 1/6? So the Gemara answers, there is a difference. As in the case of a disparity of 1/6, the one who was exploited has the advantage, since if he wishes, he reneges on the transaction, and if he wishes, the buyer acquires the purchase item, and the one who perpetrated the exploitation returns the sum gained through his exploiting the other. While in the case of a disparity of less than 1/6, the buyer acquires the purchase item, and the one who perpetrated the exploitation returns the sum gained through his exploiting the other, but there is no option of nullifying the transaction. Now, this is making me think, well, what do you mean? If it's less than 1/6, why are we talking about exploitation? There is no exploitation. But the Gemara returns to the dilemma. At what point in time is a disparity of less than 1/6 between the value of the purchase item and the price paid waived? And the Gemara suggests, come in here, a resolution of the dilemma from the Mishna. Rabbi Tarfon said to them, throughout the entire day, it is permitted to renege on the transaction, and not merely for the period of time it takes to show the purchase item to a merchant or relative. The merchants of Lod said to him, let Rabbi Tarfon leave us as we were with the previous ruling, and they reverted to the following statement of the rabbis. We saw in our Mishnah that everywhere the idea was if you charge more than 1/6, that's exploitation, and you have this period of time where you could show it to somebody who knows more than you do, the item, to find out if you're exploited or not. And then Rabbi Tarfon in Lod said, well, actually, we're going to say that you can charge up to 1/3 more, all right? And less than that is not considered exploitation. And so the merchants rejoiced. They could make a bigger profit. But Rabbi Tarfon also said that they have the entire day, not just the amount of time it would take to show it to another merchant. And then the merchants were like, oh, yeah, no, it would be better for us to have the shorter waiting period, even if the profit is 1/6 rather than 1/3. Now, that was what the Mishnah said. So now, the Gemara returns to the dilemma. At what point in time is a disparity of they reverted. Right, so I'm further on. The Gemara explains the proof. The sages assume that the legal status of a disparity of less than 1/3, according to the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, who holds that 1/3 is the determinative disparity, is like a disparity of less than 1/6, according to the opinion of the rabbis, who hold that 1/6 is the determinative disparity. So granted, if you say that in the case of a disparity of less than 1/6, according to the rabbis, the buyer can claim exploitation only in the time that it takes him to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative, and according to Rabbi Tarfon, the transaction is finalized only after the entire day has passed, it is due to that reason that the merchants of Lod reverted to following the statement of the rabbis, as there was some benefit to them in following the opinion of the rabbis. But if you say that in the case of a disparity of less than 1/6, according to the rabbis, the waiver is in effect and the transaction is finalized immediately, and according to Rabbi Tarfon too, there is a waiver of the disparity of less than 1/3 and the transaction is finalized immediately, so then why did the merchants revert to following the statement of the rabbis. In that case, the ruling of Tarfon would be preferable for them, as that which the rabbis deem exploitation, i.e. a discrepancy of 1/6, would be waived according to Rabbi Tarfon. Now, the Gemara rejects this proof. No, you're learning out the wrong lesson from what happened in Lod. Do you maintain that the legal status of a disparity of less than 1/3, according to the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, is like the legal status of a disparity of less than 1/6, according to the opinion of the rabbis? No, right? Rabbi Tarfon and the rabbis didn't just disagree on what constitutes exploitation, right? Where Rabbi Tarfon says 1/3 and the rabbis said 1/6, but they also disagreed about the timing of how this is enforced. No, the legal status of a disparity ranging from 1/6 until 1/3, according to the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, is like the legal status of disparity of 1/6 itself, according to the opinion of the rabbis, and the exploited party receives the sum of the exploitation in return. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, for what reason did the merchants of Lod rejoice initially? They gained nothing relative to the ruling of the rabbis. So resolve, based on this difficulty, the dilemma raised below, and conclude that in cases of nullification of the transaction, according to the rabbis, right, because the seller exploited the buyer by more than 1/6, so the buyer has the option to nullify the sale and just get his money back. So in cases of nullification of the transaction according to the rabbis, one may always renege on the transaction. Therefore, the reaction of the merchants of Lod is understandable, as, since Rabbi Tarfon said to them that a disparity between 1/6 and 1/3 is merely exploitation, they rejoiced, as this would mean that the buyer has only the time it takes to show the merchandise to a merchant or a relative to renege. He doesn't have all day. When he said to them that the exploited person can renege on the transaction for the entire day, they reverted to following the statement of the rabbis. So the Gemara explains why we just could resolve the dilemma according to this explanation. As, if it enters your mind to say that nullification of the transaction according to the rabbis is limited to only within that time that it takes for the buyer to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative, for what reason did the merchants rejoice over the ruling of Rabbi Tarfon? His ruling did not enable them to sell the merchandise at a higher price than the ruling of the rabbis did. So the Gemara says, no. Again, you've got the proof wrong. They initially rejoiced over the case of a disparity of 1/6 itself. As according to Rabbi Tarfon, there is a waiver of the disparity, and according to the rabbis, this would be exploitation. Now, the Gemara cites the dilemma that was referenced above. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to nullification of the transaction according to the rabbis, 1/6 equals exploitation. One may always renege on, may one always renege on the transaction? Or perhaps he can renege only within the time that it takes him to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative. As if you say that the transaction is nullified only within the time that it takes to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative, what difference is there between a disparity of 1/6 and a disparity of greater than 1/6? And the Gemara answers there is a difference. As in the case of a disparity of 1/6, only the one who was exploited can renege on the transaction. Well, in the case where the disparity is greater than 1/6, either the buyer or the seller can renege on the transaction because that transaction should not have happened, according to this view. Now, the Gemara returns to discuss the dilemma. What is the halacha? What is the law? And the Gemara suggests, come and hear a resolution of the dilemma from our Mishna. The merchants of Lod reverted to following the statement of the rabbis. So granted, if you say that one can claim nullification of the transaction according to the rabbis only within the time that it takes for the buyer to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative, and according to Rabbi Tarfon, one can do so for the entire day, it is due to that reason that they reverted to following the statement of the rabbis, and it makes sense. But if you say that one can claim nullification of the transaction according to the rabbis and always renege on the transaction, well, why would the merchants revert to following the statement of the rabbis. In that case, the ruling of Rabbi Tarfon would be preferable for them, as he deems such a disparity exploitation and rules that one can claim nullification of the transaction for the entire day and no more. Right? If they're reverting to the opinion of the rabbis, it must be that they're going to shorten that window within which the buyer can nullify, not lengthen it. And so the Gemara answers, nullification of the transaction is uncommon. And therefore the merchants of law did not take that into consideration when calculating which ruling was most advantageous. In fact, buyers who find out that they're exploited would rather get the difference in what they paid and what they should have paid and keep the item that they bought, since after all, they took the trouble to go to the market and buy it. They'd rather not overpay, but why do they want to nullify the whole deal? They went out and bought something. The Gemara cites the halachic resolutions of these dilemmas. Rava said, the law, the halacha is that if the disparity is less than 1/6, the merchandise is acquired immediately, right? There was no exploitation, the deal is done. If the disparity is greater than 1/6, either party can demand nullification of the transaction. If the disparity is precisely 1/6, the buyer has acquired the merchandise, and the one who benefited from the exploitation returns the sum gained by the exploitation, the difference. And one may claim both this nullification of the transaction and that return of the sum gained only within the time that it takes to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative. And the Gemara comments, it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rava, in cases of exploitation. Wait, I'm just thinking here. Hold on a second. What I'm wondering is, when we're talking about, having a refund of the amount of money by which the one was exploited, does that mean that you bring it back to just under 1/6 or all the way back to market value? And that question has not been answered yet. But that's not what they're talking about right now. So let me just keep reading. So the Gemara comments, it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rava, in cases of exploitation. Right? So this seems like Rava said more than 1/6, we nullify the transaction. Less than 1/6, transaction finalized. Exactly 1/6, the guy he has the amount of time that it takes to show the other merchant or the friend to come back and get the refund of the difference, right? Is that what Rava said? If it's precisely 1/6, the buyer has acquired the merchandise, so the deal is done, but the one who benefited from the exploitation returns the sum gained by the exploitation, and one may claim both this, nullification of the transaction, and that, return of the sum gained, only within the time, right? So nullification in the case of greater than 1/6, but again, you can only state that claim within that amount of time. Now the Gemara comments, it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rava, in cases of exploitation. If the disparity is less than 1/6, the merchandise is acquired immediately. If the disparity is greater than 1/6, the transaction is nullified. If the disparity is precisely 1/6, the buyer has acquired the merchandise, and the one who benefited from the exploitation returns the sum gained by the exploitation. And this is the statement of Rabbi Nassan. So Rabbi Nassan seems to say that Rava got it right, and this is the law. Now, Rebbe says, in a case where the seller was exploited, the seller is at an advantage, meaning he has a choice. If he wishes, he reneges on the transaction and says to the buyer, give me my merchandise. Or he can say, give me the sum that you gained by exploiting me. And one may claim both this, nullification of the transaction, and that, return of the sum gained, only within the time that it takes to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative. Now the Mishna teaches, until when is it permitted for the buyer to return the item? He may return it only until a period of time has passed that would allow him to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative. So Rav Nachman says the sages taught this law only with regard to a buyer. but a seller may always renege on the transaction. We saw this yesterday. The buyer has a shorter window because the buyer actually has the object, right? The object that he purchased. So he has the advantage in the sense that he can go show it to a merchant or to a relative and say, look at this. What is the market value of this? This is what I paid. Did I get ripped off or not? Now, the seller might also think to himself, I sold that too cheaply. But he doesn't have the object to go show his relative or some fellow merchant in order to get that opinion. And that's why the buyer has the shorter window than the seller for finding out if exploitation happened. Rav Nachman says, the sages taught this law only with regard to a buyer, but a seller may always renege on the transaction for the reason I just said. And the Gemara suggests, let us say that the Mishnah supports his opinion, as the merchants of Lod reverted to following the statement of the rabbis. Now granted, if you say that a seller may always renege on a transaction, it is due to this reason that they reverted to following the statement of the rabbis, as the sellers were in any event able to renege at any point, while Rabbi Tarfon extended the period during which the buyers could renege on the transaction. We're on page 51a now, but we're getting a little bit of a start on tomorrow's daf. But if you say that the legal status of a seller is also limited like that of a buyer in terms of the period of time which he may renege, so what difference is there to the merchants? Just as the sages instituted an ordinance on behalf of a buyer, enabling him to renege on the transaction, so too the sages instituted an ordinance on behalf of a seller. If the time afforded to the seller is equal to the time afforded to the buyer, the fact that Rabbi Tarfon extended this time would not be a reason for the merchants to revert to following the opinion of the rabbis rather than Rabbi Tarfon's opinion, as there is a benefit and a loss for the merchants according to both opinions. And so the Gemara answers, with regard to the merchants of Lod, it is rare for them to make a mistake, and therefore they preferred limiting the period during which the buyer could renege over extending the period during which they themselves could renege. Because of course the sellers are more expert in the produce that they're selling than buyers who are not buying this kind of stuff as often as sellers are selling it. And the Gemara relates, the landlord of Rami Bar Chama sold a donkey and he erred in fixing its price. He made a mistake. Rami Bar Chama encountered him and noticed that he was sad. Rami Bar Chama said to him, why are you sad? And the landlord said to him, I sold a donkey and I made a mistake in fixing its price. Rami Bar Chama said to him, go and renege on the transaction. The landlord said to him, I have waited more than the period of time that it takes for me to show the merchandise to a merchant or to my relative. Rami Bar Chama sent the landlord before Rav Nachman for a ruling, and Rav Nachman said to him, the sages taught this law only with regard to a buyer, but a seller may always renege on a transaction if he sold it too cheaply. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for this? And the Gemara explains, a buyer has his merchandise in his possession. Therefore, anywhere that he goes, he shows it to those familiar with the market price, and they tell him whether he erred or whether he did not err. A seller who does not have his merchandise in his possession can ascertain the market price only when merchandise like his merchandise happens to come before him. And only then will he know whether he erred or whether he did not err. Now we're going so fast, I'm going to just go forward a little bit more and finish our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 4. So the Gemara relates, there was a certain man who had silk strips to sell, and he announced that he was selling them for 6 ma, and they were worth 5 ma. And if they would give him 5.5 ma, he would take it and sell the silk. This man, i.e. a potential buyer, came and said to himself, if I give him 5.5 ma, it is a case of a waiver, and I will not be entitled to recover the difference. I will give him 6 ma and claim from him by law the return of the sum gained by the exploitation. He did so. The case came before Rava, who said to him, the sages taught this law of exploitation only with regard to one who buys merchandise from a merchant. But one who buys merchandise from a regular homeowner does not have a claim of exploitation against him. Quite interesting. And the commentaries, this is from Rav Steinsaltz, disagree with regard to whether this statement refers specifically to a disparity of precisely 1/6 or not. According to the Rosh, nullification of the transaction for a greater disparity applies even in a purchase from a homeowner, while the Rashba and the Ritva maintain that even nullification in a case where the disparity is greater than 1/6 is not in effect in purchases from homeowners. And the Rosh and the Rashba do agree that if the homeowner is exploited, he can claim repayment. Others rule that even if the homeowner was the exploited party, the laws of exploitation do not apply, as the assumption is that a homeowner is intimately familiar with his possessions, and even if he decided to sell a possession for significantly less than its market value, he cannot collect repayment. It's his stuff. He knows exactly what it's worth, or he may, well, actually, we have a lot of stuff in our houses that we don't know what it's really worth because we're not buying and selling. But of course, people sell their stuff, right? When they're not in the business of selling, when they just decide to sell something, maybe they want to clean out their closets. Maybe they just have too much stuff in the house. Maybe they want a fresh start. Maybe they really need the money and they don't have time to wait and make sure that they get the market value. And so you see that there's a dispute among the sages of whether these laws of exploitation apply at all, basically for deals between private parties in the way that they would between a buyer and a seller who is a merchant of that good. And the Gemara relates a similar incident. There was a certain man who was holding jewelry to sell, and he announced that he was selling it for 60 ma, and it was worth 50 ma, and if they would give him 55 ma, he would take it and sell the jewels. This man, i.e. a potential buyer, came and said to himself, if I give him 55 ma, it is a case of a waiver and I will not be entitled to recover the difference. I will give him 60 ma and claim from him by law the return of the sum gained by the exploitation. So seemingly the full difference between the price paid and the market value, not just enough money to bring it back within that 1/6, which would make it a waiver of that exploitation claim. So that's what he did. And the case came before Rav Chisda, who said to him, the sages taught this law of exploitation only with regard to one who buys merchandise from a merchant. But one who buys merchandise from a regular homeowner does not have a claim of exploitation against him. Rav Dimi said to Rav Chisda, the ruling is correct. And likewise, Rabbi Lazar said, the ruling is correct. And the Gemara asks, but didn't we learn in the Mishna that follows, just as the laws of exploitation apply to a layman, so do the laws of exploitation apply to a merchant. Well, who is the layman to whom the Mishnah is referring? Is it not a regular homeowner as opposed to a merchant? And Rav Chisda said the Mishnah is referring to simple linen garments, which the homeowner crafts expressly for sale. But with regard to vessels and garments designed for the personal use of a homeowner, which are important to him, he sells them only to receive extra money, as people are generally hesitant to part with their belongings. Therefore, when purchasing an item from a homeowner, a buyer must consider the likelihood that the asking price is greater than the item's actual worth, because you're not going to have that claim. Right, so very interesting that the layman here just means like somebody who has a garage business, as opposed to like a merchant with a store and a much more established type of transactional history and clientele, etc. But a layman in this context does not mean just somebody who's selling stuff that he doesn't need to keep in his house anymore because he needs to raise money or he needs the space. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 4. Nina is super busy getting the house ready for Pesach, so I'm going to scan the comments myself to see if I can identify the questions. Bill, question about a seller who was the exploited one. A certain individual who's a skilled geologist sees some farmland for sale and recognizes that the land under the field is full of valuable minerals. The seller is unaware of this and only knows the field isn't especially productive for farming and sells it to the geologist priced as poor arable land. Did the geologist exploit the seller by not explaining that the land was more valuable as a quarry or a mine than it had as a farm? So I'm pretty sure that we read a couple days ago, maybe it was yesterday, maybe I read it somewhere else, that when we're talking about the law of exploitation, it applies to movable property and not to land. Right? When you're talking about land, So if you're going to sell your land, you should have it appraised by people who know more than you do to protect yourself from exactly the situation that you're talking about. That's my impression. Joseph, can you please clarify again, what is the curse that the rabbis issue to one who reneges on a deal? Is it just on one's business reputation? No. So remember that there's a difference at what stage they renege, right? So the curse applies if the buyer comes and says, I will give you $100, for that crystal vase. And the seller takes the $100. The money has changed hands. But the buyer says, it's crystal. I want to come by tomorrow with a wagon filled with hay so that I can get it home, safely without breaking it. I'll pick it up tomorrow. So the buyer hasn't taken possession of the vase yet. Then later that day, somebody comes into the store and says, oh, what a beautiful crystal vase. I'll give you $200 for it. So the seller says, oh, wow. You know what? That guy didn't take possession of it yet. I'll give him his money back. I'll give him his $100 back yet. Now I can get $200 for the vase. So he reneges on the deal after he took the money for it. He's able to do that because the deal wasn't finalized since the buyer didn't take possession of the vase yet. This protects the buyer in the sense that if the vase breaks while it's still in the shop, the seller will have to replace the vase, refund the money, but he's still liable for the vase until the purchaser actually picks it up. So it's this purchaser who received the money, then got a better offer, so he just gives the money back, and he reneges on the deal, that the sages would issue the curse on him, the one who exacted payment from the generation of the flood, the dispersion, on the Egyptians who enslaved the Jews, on the residents of Sodom and Gomorrah, will exact payment from you. If the buyer came in and said, beautiful vase, I'm going to come by tomorrow and buy it. I'll bring $100. And the seller says, okay, it's your vase, $100, deal, come pay for it and pick it up tomorrow. So they agreed to do it for $100, but no money changed hands yet. Then another purchaser comes in and offers $200, and the buyer says, oh, I'll take the $200. In this case, the sages would not issue the curse because the money hadn't changed hands yet. There was only the verbal commitment, but the sages would be displeased with him, and this is a guy who would suffer reputational harm, but not the curse. Obviously, the one who would suffer the curse would also have reputational harm, but the curse is even worse than that. Right? And so Bill says, well, hold on. If there's a difference between equal to 1/6 and more than 1/6, what if it's only above 1/6 by a negligible amount, such as something that is 9/10 of a peruta above the 1/6 number? This feels like an algebra problem, right? Right, but exactly. I think they're only going to talk in numbers that, are whole numbers in the sense one peruta, like a whole peruta, right? But what's interesting is, so if it's one peruta over 1/6, that qualifies for nullification. Yeah, you can just undo the deal. But it's not that now that you realize that you've been exploited and it's above the market value, that you can go back and say, you charge me too much. And the guy says, oh, okay, well, here, I'll give you 2 perutas, right? One would just bring us back to exactly 1/6, and another that now brings us under 1/6. If he had sold it for 1 peruta less than 1/6, the deal would have been finalized. But now that it was sold for a peruta more than 1/6, and it qualifies for exploitation, it sounds like the buyer could come and say, I want the full refund of the difference all the way back to market value, right? And the seller would lose that whole 1/6. So certainly the sellers would be much better off, if they're trying to make the max amount of money and do it safely for their business, to get, a little bit less than 1/6 above market value. Because then once the money changes hands and the buyer picks up the merchandise, that deal would be finalized based on what we've read so far. That's what I've got, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Motzi Shabbos. So, Shabbos later and later. I'll try to get on the air tomorrow night as close to 9 p.m. as I can. It's probably going to be even a little bit later than that. All the best. Have a great Shabbos, and looking forward to a beautiful Passover for everybody. But we'll have class tomorrow night. We'll have class at the regular time on Sunday. Monday, probably no class because there's just too much Passover prep going on, even to do a noon class on Erev Pesach. But I'll confirm that on Sunday. Anyway, see you tomorrow night.